This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at Kevin Kautzman and at Brad Kelly.
Episode of Art of Darkness. This is a special dark room episode where we bring in a special guest to talk about a previous subject. But first, Kevin, it's been a couple of weeks. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. I am going to struggle with this episode because I'm in Miami. The sun is shining. The people are beautiful. The pandemic seems to have spared the people of South Beach. I think it's something in the Botox.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good theory.
Yeah. I'm gonna trust the science, get the Botox, and then suddenly it's like COVID doesn't exist at all. Amazing.
Right. Yeah. So I guess it is a little hard. Maybe it is a little hard to get into the Kafka head.
You know what? In a funny way, I think it's almost ideal. I think that there's going to be a nice kind of high contrast situation going on here, and I'm excited. There's Kafka in the sun. Try and imagine Kafka laying out in South Beach, all the Art Deco, and he's trying to get a tan, but Kafka doesn't tan. Kafka burns.
He just burns.
He burns
that's
through
right.
crisp. Yeah.
I think that's fair to say for sure.
Yeah.
So I guess we gave it away. We're going to be talking about Franz Kafka. If you haven't listened to our first episode on Franz, you can scroll back through the archive and find that. We go pretty deep on the biography. So today we're gonna, we'll maybe touch on some of that, and we've got some other things we want to say. And so we've brought in somebody who is a favorite Twitter follow of mine, among other things. If you don't know him, hopefully this is a good introduction. He goes by Heghoulian, at Heghoulian on Twitter. He's a guy who's got a interesting take on just about anything he chooses to have a take on, in my opinion. And also, I'm just going to say, I think he's one of the keenest experts on the great writer J.G. Ballard, and maybe we'll end up talking about that a little bit. And if you really want to get into the J.G. Ballard stuff, you can go to Heghoulian's Twitter, but he also recorded an episode with a friend of the show, Aldous Asterian, at Forest of Symbols. Heghoulian's got a Substack. I believe the name of that is Some Private Diagonal. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Right. Yes. That's a Ballard reference. I'm not going to explain it, but
okay, good.
Ballard, yeah.
Okay. And I guess anything else you want to say, Heghoulian, in terms of intro or things that people should know about you and what you're up to?
All right. Well, first of all, thanks very much for that very generous introduction, Brad.
Sure.
And I'm also a great big fan of your work, and
that.
you're together with Kevin.
Yeah.
Okay. Who am I? Well, I think I updated my profile recently, maybe to try and establish a bit more clearly what I'm about. So I put reactionary modernist. So I think that kind of sums me up, really. That I wouldn't say I was exactly right wing, but I'm kind of not on board with some of the developments today. And I do write quite a lot on Twitter about the modernist period, the sort of first half of the 20th century, basically, and the artists, writers, filmmakers, and so on of that era. And of course, one of those is Franz Kafka. So
But I was just going to say one of us. So I feel like there's kindred spirits there a little bit. I'm not as through this show, I'm becoming more and more acquainted with the modernist movement, particularly the literary side. But I had my share of exposure to it in undergrad, and there's something about, maybe it's because it's almost exactly 100 years ago, it somehow has started to feel more relevant to me than when I was kind of first exposed to it, say 20 years ago. Maybe I just am starting to understand what was going on better, but somehow it feels like we're in some kind of loop.
I have no way of backing this up, but I think modernism happened, but modernity never happened. That's my operating thesis.
Okay, Kevin actually, somebody made it. That thesis, that exact thesis, was Bruno Latour, the French philosopher. Yeah, so we have never been modern. Latour.
Oh, is that right? Okay,
we have never been modern. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm kind of feeling that, and the moment that triggered that in my mind recently was wandering around here again in Miami, and there was a fellow at one of these COVID tents, because of course everybody has to get their COVID testing if they want to be traveling or for a variety of reasons, right? People want to have these tests, and these people who are making these tests are getting federal dollars. So it's a little cottage industry right now, more than a cottage industry. And there was a fellow there. And again, high contrast, you're wandering around, you have all these people in their swimsuits and their bikinis, and they just come from the gym. Very few people are wearing masks. And then you pass by one of these tents out on the street, and there's a fellow in a proper mask, a face guard, visor type thing over the mask, and then a full, almost like a raincoat plastic sheet. And the vision I had in my mind was like one of the plague doctors you see. From medieval times. And I just had the thought, we're immediately into a pre-modern circumstance here. All it takes is one bad cough and everybody is instantly reverted to that. Yeah.
Well, there's also an element of, one night after troubled dreams, Gregor Samsa woke up in a hazmat suit kind of thing, right? Like, how did I get here? How did I get to be this person in this situation?
Well, may I ask, Heghoulian, and for people who want to find you, it's Heghoulian, just for ease. When this philosopher says we have never been modern, what does that mean to you?
Okay, well, if we talk about Kafka and how Kafka was modern, I think we can class him as a modernist. And I think in a similar way to the way that Ballard was modern, in the fact that he sort of confronted the modern world. He looked at it square on, and he was fascinated by it, but also, I guess, repelled in many ways by it. And I think he didn't want to run away from it, which I think, for me, especially now, really, in the age of the internet and the virtual, that people are in fact running away from the world. And exactly that's what Kafka didn't do. And this is why I think he remains such a vital writer. Is that kind of very steely vision in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're right that he didn't, and I learned this in doing the biographical work on him. He was equal parts made sort of paranoid and, what we would call had a soul crushing job. He was equal parts that, but also he was fascinated by flying machines, airplanes when they came, because there was kind of coming onto the scene in his life, and he had the opportunity to see an actual airplane fly at one point. And he was fascinated by people who could operate machinery well, right? So on the one hand, he could sort of feel aspects of increasing modernization sort of taking something away from him. But on the other hand, he had a very genuine compulsion and fascination with it, and is maybe kind of stuck between those two things in a certain way.
I agree. I mean, it does. You've got sort of in the penal colony, where there's obviously a fascination with machinery, this machine which executes condemned prisoners in a rather cruel way and very lengthy way.
Yeah. Maybe let's talk. Maybe let's talk about In the Penal Colony a little bit. Kevin, are you familiar with this short piece by Kafka? Shorter piece.
In the Penal Colony? No, I am not, and I'm not even sure we talked about it on the episode. Did it come up? It's been a few months. I mean, yeah.
I don't know that we talked about it. I mean, there's. It's interesting. I was thinking in preparing for this episode, was thinking like there's a lot of different kinds of Kafka readers. It seems like most people I talk to have identify a different piece as their favorite, which is sort of unusual. You've got people who claim it's The Trial is sort of their favorite or speaks to them the most, or Metamorphosis, or The Castle, or the shorter works. But in the Penal Colony, Heghoulian, I know you're familiar with this story. Would you kind of give us a primer on what that story is?
Okay. Well, there are basically 4 characters who feature in the story, and a couple of other characters who are mentioned. The main character is the traveler who has arrived in this colony, apparently by invitation. And he has been invited to witness an execution, which is being carried out by the other main character, really, is the officer. And the officer is extremely enthusiastic about his job and about how he carries out his job, which is by means of this machine, which is very, very, I don't know, lovingly almost described by Kafka in great detail. And it's not a machine which actually exists in reality. It's completely Kafka's invention. And this machine is being used to execute the condemned man, who is a kind of supporting character. And the condemned man is being sort of kept in line and sort of chained up to a soldier who is very bored and takes very, very little part in the action. But anyway, the officer explains to the traveler exactly how the machine works and what it's for. And that this machine is to execute the prisoner. It's supposed to write his judgment on the prisoner's body, on the naked body of the condemned man. And this takes many hours. I think it's over 6 hours. Yeah, I think 6 hours he passes out or something.
And it's like, I think the way I visualized it, it's like tattooing. It's like deep, deep tattooing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is very painful.
Right.
Yeah. But you do get a bowl of rice pudding,
right,
which you can eat. The condemned man can eat it. And as I said, the officer is extremely enthusiastic about this machine, and I think part of the reason why he's enthusiastic is because the old commandant of the colony, who he seems to worship almost, invented it. And this old commandant died. And now this officer is kind of protecting his legacy, this commandant. But the traveler reveals his disapproval of this machine, which he regards as inhumane. And it turns out almost everyone in the colony is opposed to this machine, and including the new commandant. And it seems that the traveler has been sent there to witness this execution in order to sort of condemn the method of execution, and then this will lead to this machine being, this practice being abolished. But I don't know if I should spoil the ending, really, but one thing it does, besides the fascination with machines, it does again go into Kafka's obsession really with the law, and with justice and punishment, and sort of also injustice, unjust justice or unjust justice,
right? Yeah, which is in a 1 or 2 sentence thematic description of the trial would be a good approximation of what is the vibe and theme of the trial is very closely related to in the penal colony, I think. But the machinery part is really fascinating. I know one thing we kind of wanted to talk about too, and this does relate, is the the Orson Welles adaptation of the trial, which for folks who haven't seen it is well worth your time, for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think it's a top-notch film. It's Orson Welles' favorite work of his own. And I remember when I first saw it, I got into Kafka very young before I really understood it at all. And I saw the film. It had been recently sort of restored, or somebody had found the reel or something. This would have been like in the late 90s. And there was a scene where Joseph K is at work, and there's a computer. There's like a computer that's like going to take over their job, essentially. And I remember seeing it and thinking, oh, this is terrible. This wasn't in the book. There's no computer in the book. Why did they do this? But then as I saw it again on a rewatch, most recently to prepare for our first Kafka episode, I realized that Kafka would have put a computer in the trial if he'd known that computer was coming historically, I think.
Well, may I interject, Brad?
No,
is it
ahead.
fair to say, in terms of a pop culture reference, and maybe this is even, oh God, I'm starting to get old, right? But
yeah.
It's something that somebody could grab off the shelf right away if they're a for real bussin' Zoomer who doesn't have a point of reference with Kafka, right? You could find the movie Brazil. Brazil is deeply Kafka-esque. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
the great Terry Gilliam movie.
That's a good point. I think it is. The easy reference for Brazil is that it's like 1984, right? I think that's on the face of it.
It's almost kind of like the love child of 1984 in Kafka, though.
Something like that. Yeah. I think there's a more Kafka-esque element to it. Well, the humor of it is there in Brazil in a way that it's not really in 1984, and is more in line somewhat with the kind of humor that I think Kafka tended to get at. Yeah,
this vision of a soldier or being bored, having to attend to this machine that punishes someone. It's Beckettian in a funny way.
Well, that's
or
true too.
Is it fair to say that Beckett is Kafka-esque?
Yeah. Well, I think that in the penal colony one feels relevant all of the time, right? And it does have to do with this sort of fascination, obsession, and at the same time kind of paranoia about the law that Kafka had. And I think he really managed to distill it really well. I would strongly, and I think, Heghoulian, I think you were right on to not quite spoil it, because there is an aspect of the punishment that is unexpected as you're reading it, and I think really captures the full scope of what Kafka was trying to say. I don't want to assume that I know what he was trying to say, but I think I think we start to capture it there. Yeah,
there's a very interesting detail in the penal colony, which kind of matches up with the trial, is that when the officer shows the traveler the script, which is supposed to be the judgment, actually he can't read it. The traveler can't read it. It's just so dense and a tiny script. He can't read anything. And in the trial, when Joseph K goes to sort of read the books and the law, he's not allowed, actually, and he doesn't know the law. You cannot know the law in this
right
one.
Right. Right. Yeah, I kind of forgot about that detail in the penal colony, but that's totally true. And I think there's a in this Taylor, this goes in with the trial. We're talking about the sort of correspondences between in the penal colony and the trial. I'm talking about the movie again, and I don't know, Heghoulian, how recently you've seen it, but one thing that stood out to me watching the film that I think is in there in the book, but it somehow was more present to me in the film, is how Kafka was presenting every aspect of Joseph K's life as like the trial. It was this concept of this sort of being involved in this quasi-legal process that you can't understand, you didn't choose to, you didn't even act in any way that put you into it. And you see it like it goes right down into the initial interrogation in the film. So it's Anthony Perkins plays the part of Joseph K. He's amazing. He wakes up in the morning and there's a police officer there. But the initial interrogation is actually, it's quite hilarious. There's this description that Joseph K has. They're talking about why there's this pattern on the floor where there used to be a dental chair. And I don't remember if it's Joseph K or the police officer who describes it as ovular. But then
it is the opposite.
Then the police officer is basically like interrogating him like, well, ovular is not a word. That seems like a pretty crazy thing to say. Like, your story's not making any sense, buddy. Ovular? And he's entangled in this process that he doesn't understand the rules of and keeps looping back on top of him, sort of. And I saw that as like a mini version of the larger trial that he's part of, right? And then you see it with the woman that lives in his building and then at work, and he's constantly engaged in these sort of little trials. I can't really think of a better word for it.
I managed to look up the page count of the tax code.
Yeah.
How many pages is the U.S. code?
Yeah.
It's 2,652 pages.
I feel like I got that inscribed on my skin last year, actually. It was complicated tax season last year.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, the font really doesn't get any smaller. Micro font. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I was sort of reading and researching for this, it occurred to me actually that a lot of Kafka's writings can be kind of read in the light of Max Weber's work, and actually the concept, the sociologist Max Weber,
mm-hmm.
And the concept of, I'm trying to pronounce this in German because my wife speaks German. She told me how to pronounce it. Stahlhartes Gehäuse, right? Stahlhartes Gehäuse. This is one of the most famous of his concepts, and it's been translated in the past as iron cage, but more literally, it's steel hard casing. And this term was really what Weber used to describe the increasing rationalization of life in modern society, and the sort of bureaucratization of life, everything turning into a bureaucratic nightmare, essentially.
Right.
And I think this really informs Kafka's work, but at the same time, I think while Weber paints a very negative picture of this, I think Kafka was, he's more fascinated. He's not more fascinated, but he's equally fascinated and repelled by this kind of aspect of modern society.
I think you're right. I think he does have. Do we know that if he read Weber? Probably did.
No
right?
idea.
Yeah,
no idea.
He probably did, but maybe not. Maybe that's not giving Kafka enough credit for being able to sort of see this stuff himself. That's really interesting. This concept of, I'm going to have to look up the German word.
Can you, Heghoulian, can you do me the courtesy of saying the word one more time?
Yes.
He's going to try.
Wunderbar.
It's Stahl.
I'm going to look it up now.
Yeah. Stahlhartes Gehäuse.
Stahlhartes Gehäuse. Okay, let me look.
Stahlhartes Gehäuse.
Yeah, Hartes Gehäuse. That's really difficult. I'm gonna have to look this up. That's I have enough German to be a little dangerous.
Well, and one thing I think that maybe Kafka does with that concept is I think he's very effective at showing maybe how it affects the way that a person might think. Now, his main characters are sometimes in a certain way kind of set against it, but his supporting characters, it kind of shows you the effect it has on them as people. Like you look in the trial, the people who are carrying out the trial, they've kind of become, in modern parlance, they've kind of become NPCs to a certain extent. And not in a poorly written flat character way. I think it's purposeful to show that the other people engaged in this thing kind of can't think their way out of it. I'm convinced that the Microsoft Excel is a computer virus that has leapt into the human brain, and we're all suffering the consequences of it. Right? That's just like we've got into like hyper categorization, and everything has to fit into, you know.
And it goes even further. Somebody made this interesting observation on the Bird website today. Heghoulian, I think you may have seen that. We're very active on Twitter at Art of Dark Pod, and you can find all of us sort of through the tendrils there. But someone was showing one of these TikTok gals who was pulling these crazy faces, and apparently there's a word or a phrase for what these faces are, where they really ham it up for the camera, and it's called Pixar face. So these people have taken they're quite literally embodying Pixar, and someone called it culture as cybernetics. So you are
that was me.
That was you. That was Heghoulian. Okay, perfect. Yeah, excellent. Okay, good. You see, I had you wonderful anon accounts on Twitter. I love it. It's just sometimes it all blurs together. Yeah, what did you mean by that, Heghoulian? Can we talk about that? Because that seems germane to this conversation. Where does the machine end and the human begin now?
Exactly. Yeah, I sort of got that from reading Friedrich Kittler. Kittler, who was a thinker much more recent than Weber. He died about 2013, age 70-something. And he was kind of like, in many ways, he was similar to Marshall McLuhan in the way he analyzed the modern society in terms of kind of like a technological determinism. So that the technology is really determining. He says media determine our situation, but when he says media, he means kind of things like print media. And as the technology changes, we change. And so he is, I guess, you find this cybernetics idea in Kittler, that we are kind of in a system of signals and sort of programming us. Nobody's really in charge of it, but it just kind of operates on its own, really. And he wrote actually his first major book. It's called Discourse Networks, 1800-1900. And I really need to read this 1900 part. I haven't got to it yet. But when he said he took this idea of discourse from Michel Foucault, and the idea, kind of like a post-structuralist idea that knowledge is being kind of generated in this kind of relativistic way through discourses. And Kittler was really interested in the way technology impacts on that, more so than Foucault was interested in that. So we might see, this whole culture of mass media now, and things like Disney and Pixar and so on, just controlling or sort of controlling people, programming people, training people to act in certain ways and to make certain gestures, expressions, and so on. It's not really intended. I don't think the designers of these animations intended this to happen, really, but it just ends up happening. So that's what I'm talking about by cybernetics. That we become, according to Kittler, McLuhan said that sort of media are extensions of man, but for Kittler, man is an extension of the media.
Yeah, wonderful. And this is a thread that we're poking at as we do Art of Darkness. It's not a philosophy podcast per se, but it just naturally emerges. When you mention McLuhan, I always think of that great scene in Annie Hall. You know nothing of my work. Wonderful. And I'm reminded in this conversation of the Disney episode we did, and the moment that in Fantasia they blend, and I think it's the first time this was done. Certainly it's a famous moment where they blend the orchestra conductor, so the real world shadow kind of there was it's all shadows, so it's the orchestra conductor, and then Mickey shows up in the real world. And there's that blending of worlds and the blending of the media reality with the ostensibly the real, even though of course it's not real, it's cinema. But yeah, I don't know. I'm reminded of that.
And that's an obvious choice to make if you're at the forefront of that technology at the time, but you don't realize that you have just crossed a sort of a threshold. Like in some sense, you didn't just do that on celluloid. You have actually done that in real life.
See, and I'm tinfoily enough to think they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were summoning some sort of dark. But in any case, we're straying a little from Kafka. But yet we're not. This is a writer who inspires this kind of thinking and discourse and all the rest.
Yeah,
so, very interesting.
Absolutely. So the one thing I kind of wanted to talk about. So this is interesting. I had stumbled across this quote by Susan Sontag, and I don't know how you guys feel about her. I know she can be somewhat polarizing, but let me just read this really quickly. Susan Sontag from Against Interpretation. The work of Kafka has been subjected to a mass ravishment by no less than 3 armies of interpreters. Those who read Kafka as a social allegory see case studies of the frustrations and insanity of modern bureaucracy and its ultimate issuance in the totalitarian state. Those who read Kafka as a psychoanalytic allegory see desperate revelations of Kafka's fear of his father, his castration anxieties, his sense of his own impotence, his thraldom to his dreams. Those who read Kafka as a religious allegory explain that K, in his book The Castle, is trying to gain access to heaven, that Joseph K. in the trial is being judged by the inexorable and mysterious justice of God. I just find that interesting, this sort of tripartite. To me, Kafka is doing possibly all 3 of those things and maybe more. But, we've got this sort of social, personal, religious lenses that we can put over maybe a reading of any of Kafka's work. That I think are productive interpretive frameworks. I think
I think this is one thing that makes Kafka a modernist. Because let's say you compare with Dostoevsky, writing 50 or 60 years earlier.
Right.
You've got, say, sort of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, where there's kind of, he goes kind of round the houses a bit, kind of through a sort of Nietzschean Superman kind of ideology, but then comes back at the end, really, to a kind of affirmation of Christianity.
Yeah, there's a sort of discrete moral to Crime and Punishment, even though the book is the book is a masterpiece, but there is a unit of a moral like you might find in a fable or something.
Right. Yeah. So that makes it classic 19th century novel, where the author is presenting himself as somebody who's got a clearly defined opinion or view, and he wants to pass it on to you. Yeah. Although he might go through quite a few stages, for example, the brothers Karamazov, many philosophies are presented in that book, but he does give you a view at the end. And Kafka is a modernist for one very important reason, that he doesn't want to tell you, unambiguously what he thinks. And maybe he has his own view of his work, which may or may not be ambiguous, but he doesn't want to sort of preach to you.
Yeah.
And this is crucial, I think, in terms of modernism of Kafka.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, no, this is good. Getting complexifying our definition of what modernism really means, and I think Kafka is. We were kind of talking offline about how does Kafka fit into modernism, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that right there. One thing that's always kind of appealed to me about Kafka is there is this tendency to try and see his work as allegorical, but I think he's using these structures and tenets of like an allegory, but ultimately the allegory sort of doesn't stick. it's because it's referring to multiple layers of things, just like in Sontag's the excerpt from Sontag, but also because he's in the final analysis, it sort of doesn't actually. It's like it's referring to on forever kind of thing, right? Yeah, and it never settles on it, and that's the point. Yeah,
that almost feels like. Go ahead, Heghoulian. No.
I was just going to bring in the sort of metamorphosis and this story as a kind of example of absurdism, which was kind of later, I suppose, defined by Camus in the Myth of Sisyphus in his early 40s. But Camus wanted to say, he didn't think the absurd was necessarily something objectively real, but it's just something which man has come to kind of feel in the modern world, as a kind of an inescapable reality. So there's no explanation for why Gregor Samsa wakes up as a bug. And in fact, nobody really seeks an explanation.
Yeah, if you were to write your, a grad school thesis on what was really going on with why did Samsa turn into a bug, not from a thematic standpoint, but from like a mechanistic, everybody's obsessed with world building right now in writing, which is kind of a turn off to me. But like from a world building standpoint, what are the rules that would be in place in order for Samsa to turn into a bug kind of thing? It's like that is really, really not the point.
That is a great point itself. It's like if Kafka was to write Crime and Punishment, it would just be called Crime and Crime. Or it would just be called Punishment and Punishment. There's no second act. It's just this awful.
Well, he would have decided to kill the landlord in the final second. He wouldn't have killed her, but she would have like fallen down the stairs, and it would have been his fault anyway, or something. Mm-hmm. It would have been like that kind of like folded in on itself sort of thing, I think. Yeah.
So I think so much of his work is about discontinuities and kind of arbitrary events, really, which happen, and there's maybe no apparent reason for them happening. Go ahead.
Which I was just going to say, from a perspective of a writer, that's like a big no-no. Like nothing is supposed to be random, right? It's all supposed to make sense together. And Kafka manages to pull off this thing where, like, no, if you have one big striking random thing happen, everything can flow from that. It's like, the Big Bang doesn't make any sense, but if you have it, then from there, all of these things, all of this other material can kind of flow from that one arbitrary and random moment.
Right. Yes. I mean, I found out something today, actually, that Kafka was interested in theosophy.
Okay.
And he actually met Rudolf Steiner.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he met him. He went to see him at his, I guess, some kind of office or what have you. This was in 1911. It was actually in his diaries.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Kafka kind of, I suppose he's quite young at this point. And he told Steiner, that he felt himself drawn to theosophy, but he wasn't quite sure, what to do about it, really. I think in terms of like religion, Kafka and religion, I mean, when he was a boy, he wasn't keen on going to the synagogue.
No.
But he does, I think, talk about God to Max Brod. Maybe I could find something.
Yeah.
Who was Rudolf Steiner? He was a theosophist. Was he part of Blavatsky's circle?
Right. Yes. And actually, Aldous has done an episode about this.
That's right.
You should definitely check it out. He did it with Owen Briggs.
No, that was good. And Rudolf Steiner, if I'm not mistaken, did eventually start I hope I'm getting this right. He eventually started the Waldorf school system. Is that correct?
He did.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. That's why all the Waldorf kids in grad school were so flowy and woo-woo. I love that. Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
So he met Steiner. But about Kafka's ideas about God, there is this quote from Max Brod, actually. I remember, Brod writes, a conversation with Kafka, which began with present-day Europe and the decline of the human race. We are nihilistic thoughts, suicidal thoughts that come into God's head, Kafka said.
Ooh.
Whoa.
This reminded me at first of the Gnostic view of life, God as the evil demiurge, the world as his fall. Oh no, said Kafka. Our world is only a bad mood of God, bad day of his. Then there is hope outside this manifestation of the world that we know? He smiled, as Kafka smiled. Oh, plenty of hope, an infinite amount of hope, but not for us.
Oh man.
Oh,
yeah,
geez.
that sounds like Kafka. Well, and he and this gets us into something else that I wanted to talk about in our original episode and kind of couldn't fit it into the biographical material. I guess this is one of the reasons we like doing these follow-up episodes. This gets into the Blue Octavo notebooks a little bit because a lot of the Blue Octavo notebooks deal with religious or quasi-religious themes, sort of reinterpretation of religious myth, whether it's Christian myth or he talks a lot about Prometheus and sort of interrogating that myth. And so for folks who aren't familiar with it, the Blue Octavo notebooks, so Kafka was an obsessive diarist and letter writer. And there was a period where he sort of set aside his typical diary, picked up literally Blue Octavo notebooks, and started writing almost daily thoughts and images, little bits of what you might call philosophy or theology. Some of it is like little scraps of stories, and he deals with. And it was interesting, your quote there, sort of brushing up against Gnosticism. I think he was, I don't want to say he was finding his way towards Gnosticism, but some of the Gnostic ideas, I think, made sense and resonated with him, whether or not he was actually reading those texts or not, or kind of arriving at it from his own angle. Like I'm looking at the Blue Octavo notebooks right now. There's a part, I'll just read this real quick. This is Kafka, fourth notebook in the Blue Octavo notebooks. For us, there exist two kinds of truth, as they are represented by the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. The truth of the active principle and the truth of the static principle. And the first, good, separates itself off from evil. The second is nothing but good itself, knowing neither of good nor of evil. The first truth is given to us really, the second only intuitively. That is what it is so sad to see. The cheerful thing is that the first truth pertains to the fleeting moment, the second to eternity, and that too is why the first truth fades out in the light of the second. So there's something kind of complexly Manichaean to what he's talking about here. And right next to this, he says, suffering is the positive element in this world. Indeed, it is the only link between this world and the positive. Only here is suffering, not in such a way as if those who suffer here were because of this suffering to be elevated elsewhere, but in such a way that what in this world is called suffering in another world, unchanged and only liberated from its opposite, is bliss. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. This is slightly random, but he was certainly, and now you bring up him being interested in theosophy. I mean, I think it's easy to try and discredit theosophy. There's a lot of characters in there who had their own agendas and all of that, but I think you can't. I think it's difficult to disentangle theosophy from what we refer to as modernism as a literary and artistic movement. What would you say about that, Heghoulian?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I started a book recently, which was Modernism and the Occult.
Ooh.
And this is really fascinating. Now, some of the modernists, like Yeats, were, I don't know, open occultists, really. He was a member of the Golden Dawn. And he was, kind of, he was really into that and sort of magic and so on. And some of them, I think also that well, there was even Eliot was kind of interested a little bit. There is a mention of tarot in the wasteland.
In the wasteland, right?
Yeah, I think he was curious about that, but not as much as Pound. I think Pound was more interested in the occult. But generally, the occult did play a very big part in modernism.
Right, they were all sort of flirting with it, and it held a certain appeal to. I mean, even we found even Joyce was kind of flirting with these ideas. He would dismiss them, and then also he would dismiss them out of one side of the mouth, and sort of seem to take them seriously out of the other side. So it's kind of it's hard to know what his relationship was.
Yeah, Joyce seems to have been interested a bit in Kabbalah, which is not only, I think, Jewish tradition, but there is a kind of a Christian tradition in that as well.
Right. Well, and Joyce,
the Tree of Life.
And Joyce loved. I think Joyce loved systems in a certain way, right? So there's this is an organizing principle of cosmic scope. Like, even if he didn't believe it, I think Joyce is going to want to understand that. Right. Yeah.
And there is in Kabbalism, in the tradition of Kabbalism, something very appealing to artists, really, which with Paracelsus, this kind of Renaissance Kabbalist, he held to this idea that the fall, so Adam's fall, really, is a kind of a failure of the imagination. Kind of fragmenting of the imagination away from divine. So the kind of overcoming this fall is a kind of imaginative enterprise in a way. So it's a kind of very Ballardian, actually, this kind of idea that the imagination is the kind of the source of salvation. So obviously a great. I think Blake was also very, very taken with this idea, which kind of was continued as a kind of thread through the occultists, the Kabbalists, down the ages, really. Blake famously said, "Imagination is the body of God." So,
that's interesting. I am of the opinion that almost anybody who takes their art seriously is like at least coming up to the edge of occultism in some way. Like, you almost have to, in a certain sense, and you don't have to actually know any of these texts or any of these people, but you're by dedicating the time and the energy, both cognitive and emotional, I think you are brushing up against something
even
like that.
Even someone as mainstream as Martin Amis, he called writing a spooky art.
Right.
I think if you do settle down to write, I mean. I'm not sort of writing as much as you guys, really, but you do notice that something happens, which that in your thought process, which is perhaps kind of out of the ordinary, And also bring in Ian Sinclair, this is a psychogeographical writer. He says when he starts a book, and his books are really about psychogeography. Then the phone starts ringing, and
right.
and the calls that come in are the calls he needs, these kinds of things, right? So
it's absolutely bonkers. I've had extraordinary things happen. I'm not going to go into it too much, but I would encourage people to check out the great Grant Morrison lecture on sigil magic. And Heghoulian, are you familiar with this?
I'm not.
It's quite good.
I'll share it with you on the Bird website. But if you look up Grant Morrison Sigil Magic Lecture, he just essentially says, that he went ahead. He's a comic book artist. He wrote The Invisibles. He's sort of a famous comic book writer. And he claimed that he read Crowley and he read Austin Osman Spare and all these other fellows. And he has this thick Scottish brogue. And he's like, so I decided to do it. I thought, why don't we do it? I'm just going to do it. And here's the thing. It works. He's like that. And he goes on about it. And there is a quality to it that's absolutely strange when you start to write something with the intention of shaping the world. You absolutely change your own mind. And that alone, of course, we know has this incredible power. And again, I've had extraordinarily spooky things, very weird synchronicities can start to stack one after another when you begin to write, especially when you begin to write with the intention of modifying your own reality. It's called a spell for a reason, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, one thing, I was just thinking about, I was, I write best when the house is quiet and there's nobody, even if there's nobody around, right? And so I wake up quite early to do it. But, every once in a while on a weeknight or on a weekend, the house will be empty. So I'll sit down to write. And sure enough, if I go into my workspace and I waste time, like, I've got 2 or 3 hours before the wife and kid come home. And if I waste time, say I waste a half an hour twittering or whatever, as soon as I start to actually write, they will come home. This has happened like 12, 15 times. Like, like as soon as I'm like, okay, I'm getting serious, I'm like disconnecting from the internet and, boom, they walk in the door. It's like, wow, I betrayed the magic somehow, like, and who knows if I would have just gotten right down to business, maybe they didn't come home for another hour. It's very, very strange process. Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk about before we kind of wind down is a little bit more about this connection between J.G. Ballard, and Franz Kafka. What can you tell us about what Kafka meant to Ballard, both maybe directly, maybe indirectly? What's there to talk about?
Okay, well, Ballard did list The Trial as one of his favorite books. And of course, Ballard is a surrealist. And I think, as I said early on, that they were both fascinated by the modern world and sort of repelled by certain aspects of it. And Ballard was, I think, kind of had some affinities with Kafka in the sense that he had the feeling of normality. He said there's nothing normal about normality. so all of his stories, I think, try to kind of put across that idea that the regular world, the sort of banal reality, is sort of concealing this kind of strangeness, really. And I think Ballard's heroes, his protagonists, are also questing for something, much like Kafka's protagonists. They're sort of trying to seek some fulfillment, and they are, sort of running into all kinds of obstacles. And I would say that a lot of what they try to overcome in Ballard, it's kind of like often problems inside their own psyches, really. Yeah. Whereas I suppose in Kafka's world, the problems are more external. But for example, in the Atrocity Exhibition, all the problems are in the character's head, really, in the protagonist's head, and he's trying to sort of overcome his mental breakdown by sort of reordering his mental furniture, as Ballard says in one interview. That he's trying to connect, things together in a way that makes sense. What his obsessions, whatever they are, he feels that they are linked in some way. So he's kind of doing this. I don't know. In the different stories, the T character in the Atrocity Exhibition behaves in different ways. Sometimes in most of them, he is a sort of psychiatrist who's gone insane, and he's doing all kinds of weird things, like kind of reenacting, for example, the Kennedy assassination.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Ballard says, he's trying to kill Kennedy again, but in a way that makes sense. But he's not really killing anybody.
It's all happening in his head. That's interesting.
Yeah. Although he does actually kill some people in some of the stories, to be honest. But there is a kind of a sense of deep strangeness, just like in Kafka, and also a kind of refusal of any easy answer. Ballard doesn't really care to give you some kind of cozy moral at the end of the story. I mean, like, for example, Crash. It's kind of a horrific book, but Ballard doesn't really condemn what goes on in the book.
No, that's one. That was the first Ballard that I read, and I was sort of fascinated by exactly what you're saying. The way it's sort of, there is no condemnation, but you feel. I personally felt like there was a subconscious part of me that was trying to condemn these characters, and Ballard's handling of it like resisted that. It was a very interesting effect to read that book.
It's very matter of fact, and in similar way to Kafka, I think. And Kafka's prose is very sort of clean.
It is.
And kind of spare and quite simple, but this is a bit deceptive because, he's actually doing all kinds of tricks with his prose. I mean, in the original German, there's something I found out during my research.
Yeah.
In German, the verb can come right at the end of a clause or a sentence. So this, at the beginning of the Metamorphosis, by putting the verb at the end, the sense of the sentence. So we've got this sentence which is usually translated as, one morning, Gregor Samsa awoke from uneasy dreams to find himself transformed into a giant insect. But if you were to translate it literally, it would be from uneasy dreams, Gregor Samsa awoke to find himself into a giant insect or giant vermin, actually more accurate, transformed. So transform comes right at the end.
Interesting. Yes.
So you've got this wonderful build-up of tension. Like, what's this sentence? Where's it going? Right? For the German reader.
Right.
And then the final word, brings down the full strangeness and horror, really.
Interesting.
So he's doing that very carefully, Kafka with his writing.
That kind of reminds me that effect of I'd read that before about that translation. It kind of reminds me. I remember reading something in his diaries about part of the obsession he had with writing is he always felt like he was building up to some kind of epiphanic moment, right? And he was never quite getting there. It was just this constant verging on, like, I'm actually going to get it now, right? And so
this is perfect too, because there's the Haneke adaptation of The Castle, which it's been many years. It's been a decade since I watched that. I may have to screen it again, but I think The Castle is the unfinished story or the unfinished novel. Is that correct? Yeah. Right. And of course, the film adaptation of it, it's wonderful. It's very theatrical, and it just simply ends right where the story ends, where the unfinished novel ends. And there's a little title card that says, and this is where the novel ends.
Right. And we're not going to try.
We're not going to even try to. Yep. Not our job.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Perfect.
Yeah. Well, The Castle is interesting. Let's talk about The Castle for a little bit too, because so I got curious. I wanted to see what is the common interpretation of what's going on in The Castle. Just like Susan Sontag said that there's these three armies of interpreters. What is going on with The Castle? And the sort of the first thing that came up, I suppose, if you read this in your intro to English, your intro to literature course, they would maybe describe The Castle as this: a kind of allegory for Kafka's nightmare of the unconscious world. I don't know that I agree with that interpretation. I don't know. What do you think, Heghoulian? Is The Castle an allegory for Kafka's nightmare of the unconscious world?
It's not something that came to my mind.
No. I think it goes to that external versus internal thing you were talking about. I mean, a little bit anyway.
I mean, one interpretation that I have seen in sort of PDF notes to the Castle audiobook that I was listening to, rather than reading, And in there, you've got the interpretation of the trial being about divine justice and the castle. And this is based on the fact that although it was never finished, Kafka told Max Brod what his intended ending was.
Oh,
and the ending he had in mind was that K, he's called K in the audiobook version. This is the German pronunciation of K. So K is, he's finally granted permission by the castle to work or to stay in the village, really, and work there, but not to come to the castle itself. Right? And actually, he dies then of exhaustion.
Oh, jeez,
But he's been granted something of what he wanted, right? So the interpretation of it is that it's about grace. It's about divine grace and forgiveness, or divine mercy. So that's one interpretation, but
I prefer that to it being a nightmare. Just because there's a beauty in the coming to divine grace being not this straightforward, unblemishedly beautiful process, but a process of ironies and misdirections and confusions and all it being a labyrinth to get to something like grace rather than it just being bestowed upon you.
And he's not happily ever after.
Right.
It's just something, and then you die.
Right. Yeah, and then you die.
And I feel like that's a good moment to say wind down this dark room episode. But I know that we have another 20 or 30 minutes coming on the Patreon. We always do a Patreon episode, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. And Brad, I guess I'll let you read us out. But before I do, Heghoulian, do you want to get your plugs in here so people can find you and find your work and all the rest?
Okay, thank you. So I'm on Twitter. Heghoulian is my Twitter handle. And I've got a Substack. This is a bit sparse at the moment, but I'm working on that.
Those are by the way, we didn't talk about them much, but I've read the pieces you've got on Substack. That's really good work. It was fascinating. So I appreciate it, and people should check it out. I would also recommend I know for a while you had a pinned tweet, and I imagine this tweet still exists, where you're kind of collecting your best threads. I recommend that to people all the time. So go find that in Heghoulian's Twitter timeline. It's quite good.
Sometimes it pops up because I do post something in there, and then people following me kind of find it. But I used to have that pinned, but I decided to pin the sort of podcast appearances. But there's a kind of archive of best threads and so on. So that's it.
Heghoulian, what is the origin of this handle, of this nom de plume?
Well, I'm kind of interested in Hegel's view of history as a process. I'm not, as I told Aldous, I'm not a big Hegel guy, really, but I do find his idea of the sort of process of kind of, it's a kind of deterministic process. So I find that interesting and kind of.
I may have spent some time in a philosophy department as a very tortured undergrad at Minnesota, and now I understand Heghoulian.
Right,
I like it. Yeah. That's a wonderful costume for an undergrad, for a philosophy undergrad or a professor.
Yeah,
right. I mean, I think there's a kind of something a bit ghoulish about some of my content sometimes, but that's kind of like the pun on it, really.
I love it.
It's kind of like Hegel. Hegel is kind of optimistic guy, but I'm kind of a little bit prophesizing doom, I suppose. But it's still I try to keep it not too black pilling, as I would say.
And Brad, what are we going to talk about on the After Dark?
Yeah, the couple of things I want to talk about are some elements of Kafka's posthumous legacy that I found interesting. So we'll talk about that one. That's a little bit scandalous for our Patreon subscribers. And then I think we're probably going to have a couple maybe loose ends here from this conversation to sweep up. I feel like we could go on for another couple hours, but what we're not going to, just to maintain our sanity. So yeah, we'll be join us on the After Dark episode. Support us on Patreon, and we'll get you another 20 or 30 minutes of sweet content.
Yes, do not become a Pixar cyborg, become an Art of Darkness cyborg. And a great way to do that is to support our Patreon, real people making real content. And Heghoulian, thank you so much for coming on. Look forward to talking with you on the After Dark episode here.
Thank you. It's been
All right.
It's been a great pleasure.
All right.